Hi, I'm Elizabeth Irvine. I'm the VP of Marketing for MarketMuse, a content strategy and intelligence platform. Our AI helps people make better content decisions and prioritize what to write or optimize using personalized metrics. I've been in B2B for almost my whole career, marketing to senior marketers or senior IT leaders for the most part.
And I wanted to jump in right off the bat with my typical open-ended question. Can you share a little bit about a story or two of times that you've had a positioning or messaging challenge and kind of how you've overcome those?
Yeah, there's one challenge that has snuck up on me a few times, including in my current role. And I think it happens because it's a very slow role and it's change. So your team changes, the industry changes, your product changes, the users change, how they research may change, and not all at once. And I think you end up adjusting in those moments to make positioning or messaging changes. And then when you take a step back and you're able to kind of breathe for a minute and reflect, look at things from a higher level, you see that it's like a patchwork almost. And for example, at MarketMuse, when I joined, we were targeting mid-market marketing teams, content teams, and we created a strategy to go up market. In mid-pandemic, we created a down market strategy with a freemium funnel. So you can already see where this is going. Another layer is that we have workflows for multiple roles within an organization. So content strategists, writers, editors, SEOs, content marketers. They can all use us for different, really specific things. And we created messaging and positioning for each of them. And when you target through emails, ads, on the phone, you can get very personalized, very specific. But you risk creating that one-size-fits-all kind of message because you weren't able to target, you're not always able to target so acutely, like an event, a review site, or your website, if you don't have a personalization tool. And even if you do, there's always anonymous visitors and you don't know who they are. So even with your website, it can be a risk. And really the biggest pain that we experienced was in decision-making and resources across multiple departments, because there were so many directions that we could go in and not enough resources to execute them. So what we did was kind of had this like virtual summit, knowing that we needed to reflect and try not to be everything to everyone. We took that step back, created a Fig Jam or Miro. I think we even had both of those going. And we analyzed our firmographics, came to the meeting with those analytics of our customers. What are the similarities? What are the outliers? Really diving deep into their makeup, what their teams looked like, and what their success looked like. We also did a Foursquare for product market fit, looking at customer value and customer understanding. Something was perceived as high customer value, but low understanding. There's a messaging conflict. Same with high understanding, but low value. How do you adjust your messaging to boost them up to that higher value item? We listened to customer calls and sales calls and interviewed as well. And in doing this, we found that the function, so I mentioned mid-market, up-market, down-market, we had industries that were good fits, but the function was actually the critical point. And it was a higher indicator of success for us for a successful customer. And everything changed after that. It helped us understand how our messaging was confusing people, how our perceived value was different from how they perceived it. It just kind of helped us put that really specific hat on whenever we were looking at messaging, but also making product decisions. It helped us become more aligned as a leadership team for product decisions, deal acceptance, messaging, down to specific campaigns, and made writing social copy a lot easier. It just really changed everything. So just taking that step back and reanalyzing, kind of thinking about it from a different perspective, higher perspective, is something that really helped us.
And I want to step back real quick. When you say function, can you just kind of dive into exactly what you mean by that? Because I think different people can have different ways they interpret that.
Yeah, so we found that the actions that they were doing, so maybe not even necessarily function, but the goals that they were trying to get, goals that they were trying to achieve through our platform, it was regardless of title. If they were trying to do XYZ, they could be a content marketer, they could be a content strategist, depending on their company size. There's a lot of different makeups of teams, but they're looking to do this thing. They're going to be more successful than someone who may be earlier stage in their, and this is also for a specific product within our offering. So we have a free offering, we have a premium offering that obviously a very different, there's a middle offering, and really understanding the goal between each of them made it easier to differentiate them and keep that target of the function differentiated between those as well. So what they were looking to do at that premium level, it's going to be very different from what you are able to get out of the free product. But often the messaging is the same for all of them when you're just talking about your company as a whole. And that's really hard. It's hard to get beyond that, because when you see that overall message that may tie to that premium level, but you come in at the free level, it's disjointed.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to touch on for these types of conversations. So you think about people listening that, think of it in two buckets. You have they're in a company that sells essentially one thing, right? For all intents and purposes, right? And then there's others that are like yourself. You have lots of different tools, potentially lots of different products, different, levels of the market you're going after. And one of the biggest, it's hard enough to get positioning messaging right when you've got one thing to sell, right? But when you've got multiple, and then you've got to figure out how do you make your homepage be able to sum all that stuff up in a way that makes sense, right? It gets really hard. I like what you said about this virtual summit. Now, just again, to give a little context, you had mentioned before we hit record that the company is about what size?
15 people.
So really it was like, it wasn't this huge, just for people to imagine. It wasn't like an enterprise company where you're filling an auditorium with people. It's like a reasonably small group of people, but even with, 4 people, 5 people, getting alignment isn't always easy. Can you walk us through, like, what were some of the, in addition to the 4 squares that you mentioned, like, what were some of the variables that helped you make decisions? So for instance, was it like, look, we could go after all these different kind of customers, but there's some that are just really our ideal customer, and we haven't completely tapped out that market yet. Like, I think a lot of times what happens is you could go after a lot of potentially good ideal customers, but there's still a lot of room to grow with one particular niche. And I'm kind of like answering the question for you. I don't mean to, but just kind of that thing, like what kind of conversations around like ideal customer fit, things like that happened?
Yeah, we started by coming to the first meeting with data. So we had, I think it was 3 days, and we blocked like a chunk of time for those 3 days, knowing that we didn't want to block entire days because that's hard. It's hard. So we came with data about our current customers. Like I said, that technical makeup. Who are they? How long have they been with us? We also did it for those who churned. What are the similarities of those who canceled with us, and what are the similarities of those who renewed? How are they different? And can that inform us of who isn't a good fit? And sometimes that's a more important conversation to have, because we had a similar setup like this at a previous company where we had a bullseye. So this is our target. It's the ideals. ICP for a reason. It's the ideal. But you're not, you're going to accept other deals that come in. You're going to take other customers because they're like maybe just outside of that ideal. And then maybe you have a third ring. And so we kind of thought about it that way in terms of who that ideal is and who is way outside. So for us, like I said, we help people with their content strategy. Most of the time, if it's a really, really small company, if it's a one-person company, they have so much that they have to do. Our premium product most likely isn't going to be a good fit for them, but they can come in at a lower tier. They can help make sure their content is high quality. And as they grow, they can grow with us. And sometimes just having that association can help. So we came with that initial data, and we looked at the most important pieces of value that our product offered and who was engaging with them. So it wasn't even just the makeup of the companies, but the thing that we perceived as the biggest value, did our customers perceive that as the biggest value too? Were they using it? Or were they using this lower value? That's where that product market fit Foursquare kind of comes in. And that helps shed a lot more light on that misalignment of messaging and identifying that function. If someone had someone doing the specific content strategy function, using that higher value piece of our platform, they were going to be more successful and more likely to renew. Whereas if they didn't, if they were primarily using us for writing purposes, for optimization, they're probably a better fit for a lower tier. And that's great. But identifying where they fit, it's a self-realization as a company. Of course, you're always going to want people to pay like the highest and get the most money from them and keep them forever. But sometimes right sizing is important too.
And you know, you mentioned the finding the people that aren't a good fit, the ones that canceled or churned versus the ones that renewed. You know, you think about like people that are running businesses, founders, whatnot, and they're thinking like, well, you know, why not take all the customers you can get, right? You know, what are your thoughts? Like, what are there's, you know, I have thoughts on that too, but what are your thoughts on like why it's important to actually say these are customers actually, maybe it's a freemium model or it's a very low effort thing that you can have that's a self-serve thing, and that's maybe an option. But what's the advantage of actually saying there's certain clients or customers we're not a good fit for, and we don't want to actually really, and not to be too harsh about it, work with?
It's so hard. It's such a hard, because I think it's a little easier with SaaS and having a freemium model, because then you can encourage, let's start small and grow together. And we did in the beginning, we took everybody on. But we learned that way too. It helped us figure out what that right fit is and helped us figure out our product market fit. I think setting expectations, if you are going to take those customers on, being really clear about what they can expect, what they should expect from the results that they could get, interactions with us. And I think it's kind of setting those expectations if you're gung-ho on taking everybody in. But I think you'll find over time, if you continue to do that, you end up spending more time trying to keep those people or replacing those people with new customers because of churn. It affects your numbers overall when you're looking at bigger picture things. So it's definitely a decision that has to be made earlier on, the better. But I can understand there's a lot of learnings that you can get from just people using your platform. You can learn a lot from usage and just getting those early learnings, but there is a stage when you have to start having those tougher conversations. I don't know the clear answer to it, but I think I'm a little in the middle.
It's a tough thing, right? Because it's so counterintuitive to actually, like somebody mentioned the other day in one of my conversations about your messaging is almost like a filter, right? So when you're focused your messaging on your ideal customers, if it's good, if the messaging is good, it will actually filter out the non-ideal, which is a really nice way of saying bad fits, right?
It is. It's the self opt-in. They're like, yes, I identify that you're offering something that I need, and you're speaking directly to me. I want to talk to you. So yeah, I love that.
And that's ideally what we're going for with message. All this stuff about strategy and positioning, it's ultimately to get to a point where the message is something that, like you said, somebody goes, yes, this is it. This is what I need, right? And so by identifying people that aren't a good fit, it really frees us up to be like, we can't and don't need to be the right fit for everybody. Sometimes that brings up a lot of pushback. So this is like, you know, obviously not naming names, but like in this virtual summit that you're having, right? And you have 15 people plus maybe other stakeholders involved in these conversations. You know, was there any pushback on like narrowing the focus? You can just make it very generic. We don't need to give any specifics, but just, and how did you as a marketer help kind of like overcome some of those objections if they came up?
There were not wildly. I think generally we all understood that there were some instances where most likely if this type of user came in, it was going to be hard, because we also have we take a consultative approach with our premium customers, and we meet with them and we have seen that it's harder when there's the specific profile versus these other ones. When we created that list of those to exclude, it wasn't long. It wasn't a long list, but there were certain filters that were easier for us to exclude. And that's with certain, that's more with like where targeting comes in. I think messaging and targeting can often be like too closely aligned too. So I don't think there was a ton of pushback. You know, early days, we used to joke that anybody with a website would be a good customer for MarketMuse. And I was like, how's that going to help me as a marketer? I can't work with that. But it was true because it was really anybody who goes to market with content to speak to their audience, which is still an incredibly broad group to go after. So it was really thinking about what are they really trying to do? And the other thing that happens a lot that can bamboozle messaging is you get so close to your product, you lose sight of really what your customer is trying to do and their problem and their terminology, because you get so close to your internal nomenclature that you start like using different words than your audience is. And so that was something that we actually talked a lot about too in that meeting, was where that product market fit and value and understanding. And we realized how much we were using our own like more advanced terminology, so to speak, than someone who might be new to this, but they're tasked with advancing their content and they're a little earlier in their journey of it. And we need to help them with that. So how do we adjust our messaging? How do we adjust our messaging to the maturity within the topic overall? So that's like, it makes it like a cube of complexity when it comes to messaging, but it is a factor. I think, especially if you think about this burst of AI, it'll be really interesting what happens in terms of an understanding of AI and all of these companies that are incorporating it in, and how their messaging will shift as people start becoming more and more comfortable with it. So it's kind of another way to think about your messaging in terms of like how technical and how can you keep it as simple as possible and as close to the language of your customer as possible.
Yeah, and to your point, to keeping it as close to the language of your customer, it's like, I like how you said earlier, it's funny, like anybody with a website, it's like, wow, that's kind of broad, right? But there is some wisdom to that. Maybe that's a little extreme, anybody with a website, but like, when you're first starting out and you might have some hypotheses about who might be the best fit, and you should have probably some good, strong conversation, some good, strong data, or at least some empirical evidence based on conversations. But ultimately, it's like, you got to just start selling it. Right. You got to just start selling it. And that includes marketing and sales and everybody involved in that. And from that, you start to gain more insight into what's working. I think where people get into trouble is where they start with something broader as a way just to get into the market, just to start getting some feedback, which is totally appropriate. But then they kind of get stuck there, right? Because they see that they have 17 different types of customers. 4 of them are really good. 7 of them are really bad. But they don't want to let go of any of them, right? Because it's revenue, and it's hard to say no to revenue, especially when you're starting out. So it's become a little bit of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, and that's where, and we did the same thing. We took everybody on, and we learned a lot from that. And I think if you look at it as a learning instead of survival, then it gives yourself the room to experiment and change with your customers and change with your product as you need to, instead of like, this is working for them, so we, don't touch it. And yeah, so I think it's tough, but if you give yourself that room to experiment, there's a lot you can do there.
Where does competitors come into this? Because I noticed looking at your website, and I look at a lot of B2B websites. I can't really think of other specific companies that do exactly what you do. But I imagine there's got to be competition, even if the competition is just to do it yourself or do nothing or whatever, how have you kind of looked at the competitive landscape with how you figure out your positioning and messaging?
That's another thing that comes with that change that can like happen so subtly too. When I first started, there weren't really any we had to do a lot of customer education, a lot of audience education on what content optimization was, and why you should do it. Because often people would just publish new things and wouldn't worry about the old stuff, or they would do linking strategies. And that's all changed. Google talked about their topic authority importance, and there's been a huge burst of content optimization tools, and there's been SEO tools for a long time as well. Our main product is really strategy and really helping you prioritize based on your metrics and what your authority is on what to create and optimize. And there isn't really a direct one-to-one. One of our biggest competitors is actually status quo. So what you're currently doing, what you're comfortable with, what has worked for so long, why would I bring in this tool that I have to like learn and figure out that may or may not work? It'll take me a little while to figure out if it works. And I think status quo is something that every company competes with, is that change. And status quo is safer. And I actually, this is on the flip side. I was up for renewal with a company in Q4 of last year. Almost didn't take this BDR call. I was like, we're not going to be able to switch. It's a little bit more expensive. Nobody's going to want to do this. Why am I taking this call? But the technology was so advanced and so different from anything else that I had seen. And I knew it would help us deliver results. And it was like the worst timing. We switched it. We turned it live on December 23rd. But the results were so impactful. And so if I had relied on status quo of just what we had previously, what was working, we wouldn't have had an increase that we had this year, strictly because of that change. And so when you think about competitors, you can look at parity, you can look at feature parity, see who does different things better. But in terms of the value and what they're looking to do from a company perspective, from a personal perspective too, that individual, what they're looking to do and learn and grow, and applying that to your messaging.
I want to ask about with competitors, right? I have mixed feelings about the whole, how much competitors fall into your positioning. And I know this is going to like really kind of annoy some people that are listening, but there are some companies where the category is so well known and the competitor landscape is so well known, and they're so aggressive, and they're so good at what they do and getting their name, and people call whatever it is, where, yeah, you better know your competition, right? Because they're going to go to, the review sites, and they're going to compare you to everybody else. But then there's a lot of companies are like, either it's a reasonably new category, like what you enjoyed at the beginning, right? Or it's something that honestly, the people that you're trying to sell to aren't spending that much time getting to know every other thing. And like, I know I'm overgeneralizing that, but I want to throw that out there and see what happens.
Yeah, I got all of that and identify with all of that, because we see people come in who've tried different tools. They want to try us. We've seen them be referred to us and they weren't looking for anything else, and they just want to go forward with this referral. Maybe they found us in some initial search. I think when it comes to evaluating competitors and how it impacts your messaging, it's important to know what your competitors are doing. You should always keep an eye on them, especially if they start really creeping into your specialty. But what you should focus on is your specialty, what you can do that nobody else can do, and really lean into that. That is your value, and that is why customers choose you. And the more you can get from your current customers on why they see that value and how it's helping them, and feed that into your messaging, the parity stuff won't matter as much. If they have this doodad and we have this doodad, then they're kind of like, it evens out. But what is that really special thing that they can only get from you? And how are you going to continue fueling that for them? And that's often, I've actually purchased products because of that. They told me what their future roadmap was, and I was like, yes, this sounds great. They weren't quite there yet, but they sold me on where they were going, which is a little risky, but if you believe in what they're doing and you can see that path to that. It's not like, 5 years down the line, but like in a few months, here's what we have coming out. That's more important than that direct sort of feature comparison.
Now, and I love what you just said. I wrote it down. What you can do better than anybody else, or that nobody else can, or that special thing. Yeah, I kind of think it in terms of strengths, right? I'm a big fan of Marcus Buckingham and the whole strengths thing, and I think it applies to companies just like it applies to people, right? And when you think about as a company, whether it's your technology, whether it's your teams or your people or your culture, or there's a million ways to have good. Maybe you have a really good sales team. That's your strength, right? Like your product's reasonably the same as everybody else. One thing I think about is a lot of people that are founders have companies that are almost indistinguishable when the category, like they're consultants. They do leadership consulting. They're not going to know all their competitors. There's just no way they're going to know it, right? They're not going to follow all the thousands of other leadership consultants, right? But what they can do is be like, I don't need to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be the best at this particular type or this whatever, And so I just kind of wanted to put a finer point on that and highlight that point, because I think a lot of times with positioning, it can turn into a chasing game, right? Where one of your competitors makes a change and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, we've got to add these features. The next thing you have a mess.
You end up with that patchwork. You're distracted and you lose sight of that overall goal and mission. And I always think back to Apple and Steve Jobs and being like, forget all these other products. Like, these are great, guys, but what's this one, like the one thing, focus on making this one thing amazing. And I always kind of come back to that because I think it's easy to want to expand and do more. And you can do that later. But if your main thing that is driving value is driving okay value, and you have all this other stuff that you're trying to feed to, then it fits back into what we fell into, which was trying to be everything to everybody. So yeah, it's really focus. I think that's like the overall theme. It's focusing.
Yeah, focus is really the thing, right? And that's where everything, the alignment we talk into and making hard decisions, like everything comes down to where you're going to focus. Because not only can you not serve everybody just as a general principle, your messaging can't say everything to everybody at the same time. We don't have unlimited budgets, right? So if you're going to try to like reach an audience, you're only going to reach a very tiny fraction of the people out there. You might as well have something that they all have in common, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to go back as we start to wrap up. I wanted to, mention too what you said about the status quo being your biggest competitor, and change is hard. And with any kind of significant change, there comes friction, right? There's going to be a cost, an opportunity cost to that change, or it's going to be effort, or it's going to be a pain to do, or time, or whatever. How do you think about that when you think about your messaging? Like in general, we think about the classic thing. You're going to start with the big, like, this is the huge benefit and this is how it's going to change your life. But when you think about your messaging, do you think about like, how do you address what the friction that your prospects have in their minds within that messaging? Or is that something that becomes more in the selling stages?
Probably a little bit of both. And I think that first part can be easily forgotten with the distractions, and you're focused on the benefits of your product instead of what is keeping your customer up at night. And it could be a whole bunch of different things. It may not even be this thing that you're trying to sell, but how do you make it easier for them with all that other stuff they have? I think something that has helped us a bit is the before and after. So, because the status quo could be that they've used a competitor for a long time and that's their current. It could be that they are really great in Excel and they're an Excel wizard and they don't need a fancy tool. So what would that shift be? If this is your current before, what would that shift look like? How would that change for you? And that's kind of what helped me switch with that other product. Was it would have been easier for me to stick. I wouldn't have had to change. I wouldn't have had to get my engineering team involved. I wouldn't have had to get these approvals. And it wouldn't have been over a really challenging time of year to do this. The end of December, what was I thinking? But they sold me on the vision and what could be, and I could visualize that, and I could see it was very tangible. So yeah, I think with status quo, because it's so comfortable and so safe, and you're not going to be fired for sticking with something that's comfortable and safe. It's helping them see beyond that and what that possibility is. And I think AI is a great forcing mechanism for that, because you can take something that seems like it's solid and safe and you can use it for a while, but if you can automate half of it and still be strategic around it, like automate certain parts of it, but still get maybe the joy that you have from some of that status quo, but automate kind of the boring part of it, then imagine what you can do with other parts of your time. So I think the before and after is at least a good framework to think about the structure of that messaging.